Today's presentation, we're going to have three speakers. First up is Steve Daitch, who is the Senior Elections Subject Matter Expert for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Previously, Steve served as election coordinator for Ottawa County, where he was responsible for serving 23 local city and township clerks, including providing ballots, programming election equipment, and training election workers. Steve received his BA from the University of Michigan and an MPA from Auburn University. Kristi Dougan is the Manager of Training and Election Assistance with the Michigan Bureau of Elections, with over 16 years of experience in the field. She is a graduate of Grand Valley State University. And last but certainly not least, Claudia Berry, incoming president of HASP and past president of the Holland League of Women Voters, has 30 years experience in the financial services industry and is also a former high school teacher. She has a BA from DePauw University. So I will now turn it over to Steve Daitch.
Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. All right. So again, my name is Steve Daitch. I work for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and I'm really excited to be with all of you here today. As Rose mentioned, I used to work for Ottawa County, so very familiar with HASP, familiar with the League of Women Voters for the Holland area, and just really always great to be able to get out and see everybody with this group. So I'm going to start with a few things about what the EAC is and what we do as an agency. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some stats that we collect from our National Election Administration Voting Survey, specifically talking about the 2022 elections. And if we have time, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do specifically at the EAC. So my role is in our clearinghouse division. And the clearinghouse of the Election Assistance Commission is intended to serve election officials, getting information out. So a little bit about what we do is we were established about 20 years ago, and we're the only federal agency that is solely focused on election administration. Some of you may be familiar with the FEC. The Federal Election Commission only deals with campaign finance, where the EAC is on election administration. So our mission is really to help election officials improve the administration of elections and help every American vote. So up on the points that I have up here are just a few things about what we do broadly. So first, we are structured as an independent commission. We have 4 bipartisan commissioners, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. And that commission was established by the Help America Vote Act of 2002. This came out of the 2000 election and reforms through Congress that came from that election. As part of the Help America Vote Act, we also developed guidelines to meet the requirements of that act, including voting system guidelines. So one of our primary responsibilities is testing and certifying voting systems that are in use throughout the country. We also serve as a national clearinghouse of information on election administration. That's more my role within the agency and the folks that my colleagues in the agency work on. And we also distribute grant funding. I'll talk a little bit about grant funding later on, but the original, I'm getting a, oh yeah, that's good. Okay, get Zoom notification for everybody in the room. So the we also distribute grant funding. In the initial round of funding when the agency was initially created, there was about $3 billion set aside for voting system purchases. And every state in the country has updated their voting system so that they would have modern technology, modern to the early 2000s. And since then, Congress has also appropriated additional funds. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We also maintain the national mail-in voter registration form that anyone in the country can use, except for just a couple of states. So as I talked about earlier, our mission is here. We really are created to help election officials improve the administration of elections. And I mentioned our 4 commissioners. These are our four commissioners. The chairmanship of the commission rotates every year. So this is the current setup. We have our current chair is Commissioner Hovland, vice chair is Commissioner Donald Palmer, and then Commissioners Hicks and McCormick also serve on the commission. The EAC also has several advisory boards, and these are critical to the operation of our agency. We really seek out local election officials for their knowledge and expertise and to inform the work that we do as a federal agency so that we can better help them. I wanted to highlight, we have four advisory boards. I'm highlighting three here because we have Michiganders on these three. So Standards Board and Local Leadership Council are made up of members that are election officials at the state and local level from across the country. And then our Board of Advisors is also a separate board, some election officials on the Board of Advisors, some technical experts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Help America Vote Act in more detail because it's so central to everything that we do. So essentially, HAVA established the EAC, and it assists, so helps, funds are allocated to the states through the Help America Vote Act. So when Congress appropriates money for election administration, this is the vehicle that's being used. So HAVA did a few things in 2002. So first was to upgrade voting equipment. And that was that initial round of funding. HAVA also established statewide voter databases. States like Michigan had the opportunity to save some money and use that money later on because we had already established statewide voter databases by this time, but not every state had. And so that was a requirement under HAVA. The Help America Vote Act also requires some sort of identification before somebody registers to vote. And that can either be the last four digits of Social Security number or a state ID card. It also establishes procedures for provisional voting. So states that have same-day voter registration have a lot of opportunities for folks to register to vote and not cast a provisional ballot. But states with a deadline for when you need to register to vote, like Michigan had just a few years back, have to have an option for voters to vote provisionally so that their registration can be checked if they didn't have the opportunity, if there's an error with their registration in the registration process. So all of these things come from the Help America Vote Act. It also established the voluntary voting system guidelines. We'll talk about a little bit more just on the next slide. And it also requires the EAC to conduct research on election administration. And that is the biannual Election Administration and Voting Survey. So we do that every federal election year. We'll have another round of questions immediately following the 2024 election. So the latest data that we have was collected after 2022, and the report was put together in the summer of 2023. This is a general map of our voting system guidelines. And the voting system, so most states require the use of EAC certified systems. But even the states that don't require EAC certified systems typically use systems that have been certified by the EAC. The market for voting systems is pretty constrained. So there's only so many manufacturers, only so many different systems to choose from. And most states have agreed to use at least the federal standards as a baseline for their standards. Some states go above and beyond. They have additional requirements, but the EAC kind of sets the standards for the country. As of 2022, over 90% of states and territories require either federal or state certification. And this map comes from our website. If you go to eac.gov, you can see there, navigate a little bit, but you can get to this map and you can see which voting systems are used in all of the counties that are colored in red on the map. And as of November 15th of last year, we've actually updated the voting system guidelines for future voting systems. So voting systems that are coming to the EAC now and as of last fall are going to be certified to the 2.0 version of VVSG. So these do get updated, and the latest version of voting systems, the most I suppose state-of-the-art voting systems are going to be coming out over the next several years. So I mentioned that the Help America Vote Act in 2002 provided $3 billion for voting systems, but that was over 20 years ago. So since then, Congress has also appropriated additional funds that election officials can use, and a lot of these funds are going to supporting voting systems, like machines that you're using to vote on, or other measures for security. And this was really started in 2018 when Congress appropriated $380 million for election security. And we've had an appropriation for election security, not every year since 2018, but nearly every year since 2018. And so the total, if you include, if you remember the CARES Act as well, that appropriated a lot of funds for specifically related to COVID, uh, all that money taken together ended up being about $1.4 billion for election security over the last 6 years. So that is all money that is allocated by Congress and then administered by the EAC. EAC provides those funds to the states, and the states themselves can either use that funding or find mechanisms to get that money out to their local election officials. Now, in terms of the overall cost of how much an election costs, this is relatively small. Most of the cost of elections are borne by local communities. But when Congress allocates funding, any funding for election administration, that comes through the EAC. This graph, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but it does sort of show roughly that's how the security funds can be used in a variety of ways. So some of the things that are listed on the pie chart, the largest categories here are for cyber and physical security. And then that's 37% of our funding is used for cyber and physical security. And then about a quarter, 23% is used for purchasing voting equipment. And states are kind of purchasing voting equipment at different times, so they're in different cycles. So every year, some states may be purchasing some, and others may be purchasing other systems. One thing that I want to note too, on the cyber and physical security recently, and this is a major topic in the election official community, has been artificial intelligence and how to respond to potential threats for artificial intelligence. And the EAC's commissioners voted unanimously to allow the use of HAVA security funds, so federal grant funding for protection against AI-related threats. So don't have any more specifics on that, but we are trying to think of ways that we can assist election officials as emerging threats come up as well. And just a few issues I want to share from last year. So our 2023 annual report, which came out earlier this year, showed that we distributed $75 million in federal grant funding. We have 83 EAC certified voting systems out in that are out in the world, and 6 registered manufacturers. So there are 6 companies that have taken their systems to us to have their voting machines certified. And then we've also formed some new teams. So my team on the clearinghouse side was created about 3 years ago. I joined the agency in 2021. And since then, we've still been growing. So Congress has invested in us in a few different ways. So some of that's grant funding and some of that is agency funding. And our new programs are focused on voting system security and other technologies. So things like poll books. If you've worked as a poll worker before, you'll fill in your so you have a poll book station where voters check in, laptop. Those are the sorts of systems that we're looking at providing additional certifications for, additional information about for election officials. And then also our field services team to kind of go out into the world. As we grow as an agency, we want to make sure we're being more proactive in terms of how elections are secured out in the field. I'm going to talk a little bit about our election administration and voting survey. So this data was taken from the 2022 elections, and biannual survey of all 50 states and territories. It is a comprehensive report of election administration throughout the country, and it's comprised of about 6,500 voting jurisdictions. So the number of election jurisdictions that gets talked about in the world ranges wildly. So typically most people talk about 10,000 election jurisdictions. That's about right. If you count the total number of jurisdictions, like cities, townships, counties that administer elections, that number gets you to about 8,000. And then there's other special districts, other entities that may, or cities that don't typically run elections, but sometimes do. That number kind of gets you up to 10,000. So this is a vast system, very heavily decentralized. And so working at this from the federal level is a special challenge because there's not one election in this country. There's 10,000 elections in the country. And that's something that I think is, it's helpful for election officials to get resources because it's so diffuse throughout the country. So it is a very, so the EVES is a way for us to try to gather that information and use that information to help folks find this common ground. So a few things that the EVES covers is military and overseas voting, voting accessibility, mail-in voting, specifically how many people in the country have voted by mail versus voted early versus voted in person, and voter registration data, and also poll worker recruitment. One of the things we specifically ask every jurisdiction in the country is how easy or hard is it to find poll workers in your community? And so I'll kind of go through some of the data. That one, I don't think I have a slide on poll worker recruitment specifically, but generally across the country, it is a challenge, but that varies greatly by jurisdiction. So not every jurisdiction is looking for workers actively, and some are perennially looking for workers and always have struggle. And in a state like Michigan, it's interesting too, because you can work, if you're a registered voter in the state, you can work in any community in the state. And we're so heavily decentralized that you might have 5 or 6 different jurisdictions. One of them may be completely full, others may still be looking for workers. So definitely always encourage folks to contact not just your local clerk, but your surrounding local clerks if they need help. So some of the data that we collect is was on the previous slide as well. So this chart here, I know it's impossible to see here. I tried to make it a little bit better, but kind of covers turnout data and it does some comparisons from year to year. And we try to do like election to like election. Because comparing 2020 to 2022 doesn't work because it's presidential year. Also, there's some preliminary evidence that comparing 2020 to anything is not going to make a lot of sense. So 2018 to 2022, we generally saw higher turnout in 2018 than we saw in 2022. Michigan was a bit of an outlier, one of the very few states that actually had a 0.9% increase in turnout between those two elections, those two midterm years. But by and large, it's kind of hard to see here, but towards the bottom, you can see some of that those wider ranges are places where turnout may have dropped by 10, 20%. Okay. So upcoming for 2024, the policy survey, policy survey is a part of our biannual survey. So every 2 years, we ask the states to fill out a piece that just the states are filling out. So we're getting 50 responses back instead of almost 7,000. And those responses are things that are set at the state level. So if you have same-day registration, for example, every jurisdiction in the state should, not always, but should have the same answer. So we ask the states those sorts of questions and what their policies are. That survey can go out before the election. It's just kind of laying the groundwork. What are the rules out in the country? And then after the election, we start collecting data on actually what happened during the election. How many people turned out? How many people voted by mail? And we compare those numbers. And just for reference, off the top of my head, we have the full report is available on our website. But in the 2020 election, we had the highest proportion of votes cast by mail. That was the first time that had ever happened. It was roughly around 40% of votes cast were by mail. The remaining in-person and early voting were split fairly evenly, around 30%. And so that was both in-person and early voting were about 30%. Don't expect that necessarily to be the case this year. I think looking forward across the country, Michigan and Connecticut have expanded early voting options. Early voting continues to be a popular option in a lot of places, particularly in the South where it really started. So this is something we'll probably see changing as voter behavior changes. My hunch, though, is that we'll probably see mail voting sticking at a relatively consistent level, although probably a little bit of a drop, kind of like what we saw in 2022, where 2020 was, again, kind of an outlier for mail-in voting. So I just have a couple of minutes before questions. So I just want to talk a little bit and kind of skip through some slides about what I do in the clearinghouse division. So one of the first primary things that we do is we try to help election officials recruit poll workers. Our main initiative for this is National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. And we started this in 2020 to try to get people aware of the issue and sort of start a national conversation about this. We have states that have partnered with us to share information. We put together the graphics that you see on the screen and other tools for states to share, states and local election officials to share to help recruit voters or poll workers. So this year, that push is going to be on August 1st. A lot of jurisdictions have already hired their workers by this point, but that is kind of a critical time to make sure you have enough people to serve your presidential election turnout. We also have all of these materials on helpamericavote.gov, and that's really geared towards poll worker recruitment. And then we also try to get timely information out to election officials. Not sure if some of you may be familiar. Earlier this year, there were several jurisdictions in the country that got suspicious mail, and some of it was dangerous, some of it was not. But we worked with the Postal Service and other entities like Homeland Security, the FBI, to create resources for election officials to show what to be on the lookout for. And as part of this process, we worked with the USPIS, which is the Postal Inspection Service, which is basically the law enforcement arm of the postal system. I did not know existed before this project, I will admit. They will also be the first to tell you that they are the oldest law enforcement agency in the country. So they do investigate and track down any crimes related to mail, and that is extended to election-related mail. Oops. Thought it wasn't working, then it worked too well. Okay. Okay, so we've also been working on training materials to help election officials get training materials out to their poll workers, to their communities. So some of these have included a series on accessible elections and making sure that your polling places are set up accessibly, that you're interacting with voters who need assistance in appropriate ways. So these are all available on our YouTube channel and intended again for election officials to help serve their communities. We're also working on something called a learning lab, which is this is in the works, where we're gathering materials and training resources for election officials where they can help train their poll workers. And I'm running short on time, so I'm just going to quick do a couple more things. We've also put together other communications tools. Communications is sort of one of the main things that election officials can do to serve their communities. And it's also one of the biggest challenges that they have, not just this year, but for the last several election cycles. So some of the images on the screen are things that we've put together, a book, a 100-page document with 150 different images for election officials to customize and use to communicate critical information about elections to their voters on social media platform of their choice. And we've also been working on tracking any AI-related issues. And one of the documents we put together is an AI toolkit, basically an overview, what are AI tools for, with an eye towards election officials. What are things that you can use this material for? What is something that you should be aware of and definitely not use it for, or also know that people are probably spreading online that may not be great. And then also putting together materials in a handout format that you can distribute in the real world to try to get people directed to the correct locations, especially for things like election night results or official information about how to register or how to vote. Okay. So this is all of our information. We are on all of the things, but especially eac.gov. And our general email is clearinghouse@eac.gov. But you can always get a hold of me at sdaitch@eac.gov. And thank you all very much. And I'll take questions.
Thank you, Steve. If you have a question, please wait for the microphone. If we don't get to you, because we have a lot to get in this session, Steve has agreed to stay afterwards and he can answer your questions one-on-one if you'd like.
Yeah, the map you showed earlier in the presentation on both states that certified the voting systems didn't show every state being certified. Is that because they don't want to work with your agency because it's a federal agency, or is it because you found some reason not to certify their systems or some other reason?
No, that's a great question. I should clarify that map is just of the voting systems in use. So some of the states that are listed there, we just don't have the data. So that's not a full picture of which states use EAC certified equipment. About 90% of states use EAC certified voting systems. The 10% who don't have different state standards that they use instead, and the reasons for that vary.
Just a quick follow-up. If you found a system that you wouldn't want to certify, what happens then? How is that followed up? It's not voluntary, but
sure. I can more than happy to go into the weeds more later on how voting systems are certified, but it's a really good question. So we contract with the National Institutes of Standard and Technology and let's see, test labs throughout the country that literally kick the tires. And when we say test the voting systems, not only are we testing that they count votes accurately, we're also testing things like, it's an electronic piece of equipment. Will it give the user a shock? Or what happens when you drop it? So we're testing it for all of the things that any consumer technology would be tested for. Yeah.
I have a question about poll workers. Is there a database or is there information on which jurisdictions need poll workers, or do you have to just reach out as a poll worker, reach out individually to jurisdictions?
That's a great question. So we don't keep a federal database. I don't think people want us to keep federal databases of things. But I'll defer a little bit to Kristi. I don't know what the state's working on in terms of, the state's helped with this issue in the past quite a bit. But I will say it's always a good idea to check in with your local elections office because they're going to be the ones who have the most accurate information. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to follow up on that subject matter. If they have their own local standards and procedures, do they get federal money? And if they get federal money, must they adhere to your expectations and standards? So it's a two-part question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So my understanding of this is that the way that federal grants are allocated to the states, it's a formula grant. So it's not, we're not requiring, even our voting system standards are voluntary. So states are not required to follow those. Most do, because they are, the states find value in them. So that's a good thing. But the ones who don't, it's not required. And so they do still get federal funding, and the funding is generally allocated by population. And then the states and local jurisdictions have an opportunity to determine how those funds are spent.
For clarification.
Yeah.
Can they spend the money on anything they choose to use?
Oh, no, they cannot. So they still have to, it's a great question. So there are federal grant guidelines. They have to be able to meet our guidelines. And our commissioners vote occasionally to allow additional uses. So for clarification purposes, the commissioners voted that if election officials are doing something for security and it's just to address an AI related threat, that's fine. And they wanted to make sure that's clear in case people are using funds that way. But typically these are things that the federal requirements are very specific on what you can use security funding for. Some of that's voting equipment. And then states may have additional requirements. For example, if you're installing cameras, or if you're installing, if you're building a wall for additional protection of an office, those sorts of things may be allowable, but maybe you have to split the cost. So those are things that I can't directly speak to, but those are projects that folks are working on. Yeah, absolutely.
We have one from the chat. In this day and age of scams and phishing, how do we ensure the policy survey is authentic and safe to complete?
Okay, yeah. So I will say that the survey that we put out, it's for a known universe of people. So not just anybody can complete the survey. We work very closely with the states and have a direct point of contact, somebody that we know. So I think if you're getting an email and and it has an attachment on it and you're not sure where it came from, just don't open the attachment, right? And I would extend that to all of our partners as well, get an email from us. It's like, this seems weird, but it says EAC on it. Like, just so, but to answer the question, basically, folks can call us and ask. It's a pretty small group of people that are filling this out. Yeah.
With the current strident conversations surrounding people going to the polling stations and challenging other citizens, et cetera, is there a problem or a decline in those willing to be poll workers? Do you know that?
Well, that's a great question. That's definitely been part of the national conversation. Is election officials have retired early or have faced a lot of difficulty in their positions. And so there has been some research done on election officials specifically, not directly poll workers. And some of that research has been interesting. So folks, there's individual cases that are really hard. And like there definitely been instances of folks who are leaving the field because of threats to their personal safety or just the general stress of the position. Overall, when folks leave the field, it seems like they're being replaced by folks who came from the office. So it's not necessarily election, like brand new folks who are in the field. But I have heard just anecdotally from election officials that it does cause problems in terms of recruitment of election officials or election poll workers. And it's a tough balance because on the one hand, you want to be honest with folks and say, this is going to be, it's a long day to begin with. It's a lot of customer service already. And then on top of it, you're working with folks who may not be the most pleasant or in the most pleasant frame of mind because of the options on the ballot or whatever's going on. So it's a challenging thing to balance that with the need for recruiting folks. And often a lot of places that even if they don't have a need for poll workers, they probably don't have enough poll workers that they can split the shifts. And that's something that some communities do if they have enough people, and that can kind of help lighten the load. But it is sort of generally a concern. And I know that poll workers that are out there too, that I've talked to, just anecdotally, it's something that's on their minds. And that's really unfortunate. Like we really need folks to be able to work in a polling place, and in any work environment, you should be able to feel safe where you work.
Okay, we're going to keep things moving along and bring the next presenter up. Remember that Steve will stay here after the presentations and can answer questions. So thank you again, Steve.
Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you for having this opportunity to address senior professionals. When I was saying I was going to Hope College to address senior professionals, I reminded them it's not the seniors at Hope College, but it is the good folks of the community that are still continuing their learning, and this is fantastic. You are our best advocates when it comes to dispelling a lot of the myths and misinformation that are out there about elections. And hopefully you can attest to a lot of this. You've been voting a long time. Hopefully, I'd use my own father as an example. And so at 80, he's been voting for just a couple of years, and he was a countywide office holder and just was a pretty savvy voter. But then, talking to him, he learns just as much from me every day about, what he hears on the news and checks it in. So I'm glad that you are all doing this. So as introduced, I'm Kristi Dougan with the Michigan Bureau of Elections Training Election Assistant Section. So my area of the Bureau, we're considered what we call clerk facing. So we are the support and training crew for Michigan election administrators. And So in Michigan, we have a very decentralized local election system. So we are one of 8 states that conduct elections on the local level. Most states do it on the county level. We're the largest state that does it in the decentralized manner. So we have 83 county clerks that are part of the election system. Some county clerks, I've heard them liken it to, they're the ones that set up the party. And then they're the ones that clean up after the party, because they do a lot of the development of the ballots and the programming of the election equipment. And then it's the city and township clerks. As you can see, there's a total of 281 city clerks, 1,240 township clerks. Michigan is a very proud township-based government that has had some cities birthed out of that. And they are running the elections day to day. And then the county clerks come back in after the election to assist with county canvass. And it's essentially an audit of the election and a review of the physical documentation and the outcomes. So with that, there is strength in decentralization of elections in Michigan. Clerks know their communities. And it is important. So when you're thinking about if there are infiltrators or folks that are trying to disrupt and cause chaos, more often than not, the clerks are very aware of who these individuals are and are prepared for them, or they know their communities and how to serve their communities and work with the needs within the resources of that community. There are certainly some drawbacks to decentralization. There are parts of the state that are less resourced than others. And the volume in which they may approach a lot of election procedures may differ across the state. So one of my primary duties is to conduct training. And so I have a statewide training program. But it is at times we have to adjust that to make sure that we are focusing on the needs of those individual communities within there. So now with Michigan being decentralized, we have the Michigan Bureau of Elections, which there is strength in the uniformity in which we conduct elections in Michigan. So we have the Michigan Secretary of State, who's the chief election officer in the state, and we establish at the state level through Michigan election law and working through some national standards with federal laws to make sure that there's a uniformity to the experience of elections. So in Michigan, you'll be anywhere you move, the manner in which you are voting is the same, the equipment is the same, so you should be able to move anywhere in Michigan and see a ballot and that paper ballot going into an electronic tabulator. It is the same in all of our counties and all of our local municipalities. So there's really strength in that uniformity in that tabulation of equipment. But as I noted, the volume and resources do differ in some parts of the state. So later, they'll be covered all of the changes in Michigan procedures with election law with the passage of Proposal 2. And I'll just kind of note that all of those 1,604 election officials in Michigan, which we, other than Wisconsin, I think we have the most in the United States. Wisconsin does it very similarly to us. Wisconsin just has smaller towns than we do in some parts, but and that's all those clerks have had to learn all the new procedures, and essentially they're running 3 elections with every election date. So they're running a by vote election, and they're running an early voting election, and then they're running a robust election day program. And so it is very involved, and Michigan is very fortunate to have that hybrid approach to elections. Michigan voters have a lot of choices and really lack barriers to access to be able to vote. So what I focus on is training at the state level. So when you walked into, we have had a number of election security boards that explained the life cycle essentially of elections. And so I'll get into that. But what I focus on primarily at the state is conducting election official accreditation, which is the foundational election training on procedures, and it's all based on Michigan election law, various federal statutes, the Michigan Constitution. Then we kind of go down to AG opinions, and then probably noticed some news recently about some judicial rulings that will impact us for this election. So we are constantly having to monitor and adapt and update. So that is when there's a joke in the election community that I think some folks may have the misunderstanding that election officials only work about 4 days a year. And what do you do the rest of the year? It is preparing for the elections. And actually right now has been literally my busiest point. It's always about May and June in an even numbered year when we're doing the most of our training and establishing our preparation for August and November. We have done a lot of focus trainings when it comes to Proposal 2 and integrating these new requirements with absent voter ballot drop box and permanent ballot lists and early voting and other voter options. And we have done these focus trainings. You can see from our number here, over 2,500 county and local election officials attended some form of those trainings. So you can see we have officially 1,604 election officials, but they all have a deputy or someone else that backs them up in their office. And so we have really done a great job at learning ourselves to understand the processes and then putting those into praxis for Michigan voters. So what I just wrapped up Monday, I'm like, what day is it and where am I at today? Is we do every even numbered year, we do an election cycle preparation and continuing education course. It's required every 2 years. We just wrapped up we would all 83 counties in the state because it's important to us to meet the election officials where they are. And so they can tell us and be in the room together too, to hear each other's struggles and questions and say, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. Or sometimes they realize, oh, you have those folks asking those questions of you too. Let's work on our response or know that we can confidently, because we've heard of others, how they're preparing, confidently say that that is not how it happens here. So again, that's where I go back to the uniformity in Michigan. We get a lot of pushback from folks that say, well, I trust what you do here locally because you know your election official locally, but maybe over in Southeast Michigan, we don't quite trust. It's the same standard, the same procedures, just at a higher volume. And so the same dedicated election officials and administrators. So what we've been providing this year with the Bureau of Elections as well, and an ability to reach out to our voters is the My Secure Election experience. And that is what you walked through on your way in. Those boards, they're intended for election administrators to have to provide an explanation to their voting public about the election process and how much preparation goes into elections before folks get their ballots, and then all the testing of the equipment and all the then all the checks and balances. Someone asked me earlier this morning, I usually vote by mail. How do I know that if I show up on election day that those folks will know I already voted? And you can see on those panels, there's a lot of work that the clerks do where they check in your ballot, and that system will communicate to the computers that are at the early vote center. So you'd be stopped at that point. And then the same thing would happen on election day. So if someone didn't vote by mail, but they voted at an early voting site, which might not necessarily be in your neighborhood, but be I think Ottawa County had 4 spots to do early voting. All of that is connected and secure real-time information. So as soon as that person is early voted, the local clerks who may not even be there have that information that that person voted. And so if for some reason they were issued an absent voter ballot and it comes to them, they go to check it in and says, this person has already voted. So there are processes and technology that helps to provide those checks and balances. And that's really what there's people involved, there's technology involved, and there's processes involved. So we kind of call it the three-legged stool of election procedures. So that's what's explained in those kind of 10 posters out there. And, just making sure that we get the information out there. Not every place can set up those posters, and I've been asked if there was more of a handout of those items. And so we are creating some little booklets. And this would have been ideal for you because there's even it kind of shows these posters in the smaller format. And then there's literally a page for your notes and your questions, and would be ideal for groups like this. So I will make sure to get some of these to the organization, to where if you were taking this on the road, to be able to do these, rather than having to set up the big posters and so forth. But those are all a part of what we're developing. And these items, as Steve was mentioning, there's a lot of federal election security funds. This is part of the result in Michigan, our development of programs like this to communicate with our voters in the elections process. So I kind of explained this already. We're going to have like the little pocket guides and the step-by-step posters that would be available. So maybe you're a part of another group, whether it be your church organization or the Rotary or another service organization. Having folks together to have the information in front of you would be hopefully beneficial, and have whether it be the Holland City Clerk that's able to come out and speak about this, or Justin Roebuck, your county clerk, or his elections director, they'd be able to provide this as well. So the 11 poster series does provide a framework for Michigan elections experience. Each step covers the people, the technology, and the tools, and the cross checks involved. You probably hear that term a lot. There's checks and balances in everything. There is accountability throughout elections. There's always a balance between the number of voters who show up and the number of ballots tabulated. And there's multiple places where that information is recorded and accounted for. There's multiple days in the elections process that information is accounted for. And so although the posters are not intended to be exhaustive, they tend to present by someone who understands elections and able to give this information out. So pretty much, we've covered the proof of eligibility. So even starting at that question of who is eligible to vote in Michigan, taking away some of the misinformation about non-citizens voting. Michigan is pretty straightforward in that with how the voter registration system works. And then step 2, ballot and tabulator programming. Probably don't even realize all that boring stuff gets done in the office behind the scenes. There are actual promulgated rules in Michigan that have the effect of law that literally say, as a ballot is marked, this is how the tabulator should look and count that ballot. One important experience would be this August in a primary where we're narrowing down our choices amongst the 2 major party candidates. In a primary in Michigan, the instructions are that a voter has to choose which political party candidates they wish to vote for. So August primaries tend to, because you have both choices printed in front of you on the same ballot. And I joke when I'm training election or clerks that usually the voter thinks, thank you for those instructions, where he says you have to vote in one political party or the other, but that must be for the guy behind me because I can mark my ballot anyway. But the thing is because we have programmed the equipment to follow the rules of where it's supposed to look in the cross section for votes and what is a legal vote, the tabulator, if they didn't follow the rules, will reject that ballot and give that voter a second chance to get to spoil that and get another ballot. that second chance voting is the cross section of what we are required in federal law. So there's a lot of cross sections between what's required in federal law and state law. But we want to make sure that every voter who does appear to vote is provided the opportunity to have all of their votes count on their ballots as cast. So there's, all that kind of goes into it. And then once we get it all programmed, we do test it to make sure that what we put into the computer and then physically mark ballots and feed them through. And in fact, I think I saw an announcement today that Ottawa County is doing their public accuracy tests in City Grand Haven, I think at about 11 o'clock. So if you race over there right when we're done. But I think they have some other steps. And I've compared it to watching paint dry. You usually only kind of have to watch it once and you're like, okay. So sometimes it's like, if you can tolerate doing something this boring, it's gotta be right. But it's not meant to be exciting, but it is meant to test the integrity of the program. And so all of that is explained out there too. And then the steps of absentee voting, just understanding the life cycle of a ballot. And all how it is secured, then how it is eventually tabulated and how that record is kept so that that voter is accounted for in that manner. Because then, of course, we have early voting. That has definitely been a big challenge this year in implementing throughout the state, because that is what is brand new to Michigan. And then Michigan being a pretty independent state. And I don't say that in any sort of partisan form. I say that in just the spirit of a Michigan voter. They're pretty independent there. There's always been this movement of Tuesday is election day, and darn it, that's when I'm showing up and I'm going to vote then. And I'm going to know I showed up and voted. So even as we moved in 2020 during the pandemic more towards by mail voting, and then kind of came out of that with the constitutional amendment to add early voting, there is still a strong contingent of Michiganders that want to be able to do vote on election day. So all of that is integrated in these. And then, of course, after the election, there is certainly a review by a bipartisan board of election canvassers and all that. So, and even when they're done with that and we've certified all the results, we go back and we look at it, we audit them. So if anybody, I don't know if there's might be an auditor in the room of kind of knowing, probably more financial auditing, but we are looking at the procedures and the paper outcome of those procedures and making sure it makes sense. And if it doesn't, sometimes we find places where we say, we need to train those procedures better and shore those up. So you saw those posters out there. The pocket guides will be coming soon. And I would assume we have a lot more questions. We do have our election security specialist with our office. But I selfishly said I wanted to be able to come out and talk to folks out at Hope and also in talking to the officials, they said, the training of election administrators is an important part of the security, that knowledge. The clerks in Michigan are so conscientious and really they will worry and they will prepare and overcome. As the question was asked of Steve about the turnover in election administrators. Yes, there's certainly a segment of election administrators are finding it a challenge as every day because they're public servants at heart. They do want to serve their communities. And when all of their processes and procedures are constantly questioned and barraged, that sometimes chips away at their will to continue to serve. But then there's kind of the opposite reaction to that, where you have some clerks that say, I will not allow this period of time to drive me away from this field, and I'm going to stand up for my voters. So we've seen both, and we've certainly, through working with our federal partners, been able to recognize where we may have an infiltration of folks who may not have the best of intentions when it comes to entering the election sphere. But they're going to stick out because we know our Michigan community. But I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Kristi. I'm feeling a little bit exhausted after listening to both you and Steve. That's a lot you guys have going on. So we could have time for a few questions before we let Claudia be our wrap-up hitter.
You know, I know you talked about uniform, some procedures with it throughout the state, but I know a few years ago, say Ottawa County and Washtenaw County and Oakland County bought equipment that was different than Allegan County. So does the state have any input on that or preference or control over what kind of voting equipment that counties will purchase?
So as far as the tabulation equipment, Michigan has primarily what we've determined to have a uniform system that all has to be the paper ballot with an optical scan for the tabulation. So that is the same. But we also work with EAC and recognize through also state certification, certain vendors who can deliver based on our standards and the promulgated rules in which a ballot markings need to be counted. And so we did a vetting process about 7 or 8 years ago. So we're due in a couple of years. It's about a 10-year cycle where we certified 3 different vendors to be able to provide election equipment. State law allows for the county clerk to make the decision as to what vendor they will go with, and they consult with their local clerks on thinking about voter usability and access to the equipment and the security of the equipment, or how easy or not complex it would be to program the equipment. And so there's a lot that goes into it, or what kind of reports they can pull out of it. So yes, Ottawa County chose something different than Allegan County. There's also some mechanical pieces where there's a reason why some clerks chose what Allegan County chose versus what was a little bit more advanced, or I shouldn't say more advanced, but a little more different forward thinking on the system that Ottawa County produced, and just created some different procedures. But it really is still the voter interacting with a paper ballot, making a physical mark on that ballot, and this optical scan, looking at the coordinates within that ballot to produce the result. So same.
Time for just one more, and Kristi will also
Okay.
stay afterwards and answer anything.
Just a quick question. Why does Michigan use a paper ballot that you have to mark by hand? As I came from a state that used electronic ballots, and it just seemed cumbersome to me, or very different.
That might, it does stem with Michigan law and determining when HAVA came to be on the federal funding. The decision, we had a trigger in Michigan election law that said we would go to a uniform voting system if there was ever federal funding available to do that. And so when that came along after we had that 2000 election where we weren't quite sure who our president was for a while, Congress released a significant amount of funds into the election sphere. And so when Michigan got, I think, $105 million, and we had never seen that kind of money, but then went to this. So the decision was made by the Secretary of State at that time, Terry Lindland, that would go towards this uniform process, and it would be an optical scan. There was the desire to have that paper backup of that was the voter's record. And some of the electronic touch screen voting, some give a receipt, some don't. At that time when we converted to optical scan, those direct recording devices weren't giving very good receipts. The voter was walking away going, well, I hope it took what I put on there. And so the voter knew they could mark their ballot, review it, and then still have that machine check of their markings, and then the machine tabulation of that and the reports. And so I think Michigan, being a fairly independent state, has worked for us. We have voter assist terminal devices, which are the on-screen marking, and but it will still print on a physical ballot that voter can tabulate just like all other voters too.
Thank you, Kristi. Appreciate that. And we welcome, go ahead. Yeah, we'll let her have it. And we welcome Claudia.
Probably as far as I'll be able to get it to move.
Oh, okay.
Kristi, thank you. When Amy came to me, about 6 months ago and said, we need to talk about voting and we need to find a way to help people understand that there shouldn't be so much apathy in voting. But actually, I think right now, with the great work that Steve and Kristi are doing, we decided to take it from the national down to the state level and finally here to local to talk to you. But actually, I'm preaching to the choir because you people, as I am, we are the voters. And just to let you know that in the 2020 presidential election, nearly 66% of the eligible voters were between the ages of 45 to 64. However, 72% of those eligible voters were over 65. So we hope as you listen to this, that you will talk to other people, share the information, and understand the security that is involved, and particularly in the state of Michigan. Michigan has a lot of security in place and a lot of things that have been done over the years, beginning in 2018, to talk about your voice and your vote. And let me see. And we'd like to look at it, and this was put together by the League of Women Voters, that we are a toolbox. And there are tools that have been in place for a long time, tools that we have enhanced. And then in 2022, we got some brand new tools. And what is important to realize is these tools are in the Constitution. So they are embedded. They cannot be changed by the next legislature that comes in. The only way that they would be changed is if we were to decide to vote to make changes to the Constitution in the state of Michigan. So we enhanced some voting rights, and that's the certification of our elections. We have improved our absentee voting with Prop 2 by giving prepaid postage, enhanced ballot tracking. You may, and there'll be some website you can look at the end and take down that will allow you to track your actual absentee ballot when you send it in. We have notifications and we have added secure drop boxes. The fundamental right to vote. That means you as a U.S. citizen have the right to vote. It is embedded in our Constitution. Now, a Michigan resident or a resident of your city or township, you must have been here for 30 days before you can cast your ballot. You have to be at least 18 years of age, and you are not currently serving a prison sentence. Now, I will tell you that if your trial has not come and you have not been arraigned and you are not in jail, you may cast a ballot. I'm not going to take too many questions unless you have some. We all know what our voter identification is. We know what we need. Initially, you need a Michigan driver's license or state ID, a driver's license from any other state, a U.S. passport, a military or tribal photo, local government ID, or student ID. If you have any of those and you show up to vote, you are really required to show them. But let's say that you don't have that, but you are registered to vote. You will be asked, if you can't show a photo ID, you will be asked to sign an affidavit of voter not in possession of a picture ID. Well, how does that work? Well, the way that works is, what it does is you sign the signature, and then the clerk will know. And if you do not have a valid signature, your ballot will not be cast, and that will be checked by your clerk, either at the city or the township level. So your signatures are very, very important. Now, when you get, if you get a request for an application for an absentee ballot, or you automatically have signed up for the permanent ballot, look at how your signature, your name is listed when the mail comes to you, because that is your valid signature for signing on your absentee ballot, or if you needed to sign an affidavit, a voter not in possession of picture ID. Be amazed at the number of people who come into a voting place and you ask for their ID and they tell you, oh, it's in the glove compartment of my car, or it's in my car, or it's at home. So people, if you're like me, I have my driver's license always with me when I'm driving, but there are people who do not. Thanks to Prop 2, most early voting, and what Rose gave you a handout. On the front of the handout is Ottawa County, which we'll talk about people running in the primary. On the back of the handout is information about early voting. Prop 2 2022, we passed that there is early voting in statewide and federal elections. There was not early voting on the May 7th election. But we must offer it, and that means it must be for 9 consecutive days before the election and for at least 8 hours each day. Now, that doesn't mean, if you look at the back of your sheet that Rose handed out to you, if early voting is an option, it will show you the 4 locations where you can do early voting. It will also show you the times of when those locations will be open. And then early voting will also be available for the November general election. As Kristi pointed out, many people in Michigan like to vote in person, and sometimes they are not here on our election day, so they may now take advantage of early voting. Let me give you what happened on February 27th. 1,879 votes were cast for early voting. More than 1 million from votes of visited early voting, and about 900,000 returned theirs via absentee ballot. That's not a lot of votes to be cast in that February 27th primary, if you thought about it. With how many registered voters? I don't even know in the entire state. Kristi, do you know how many registered voters are in the state of Michigan? 8 million. And so in that primary, only 1,897 people voted. This will run, you can see on your list, it runs for 9 consecutive days, at least for 8 hours. And it's 60 days before the election. Our locations, and Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Georgetown, Polktown, and Grand Haven. I want to thank Justin Robach for putting this into place. This was a very big undertaking with very short notice. I don't know, has anybody in the room, have you taken advantage, or do you intend to take advantage of early voting? Don't see anybody. Early voting is, as you know, the opportunity to experience this. The second way that we are seeing a lot of voting is absentee, is when you request a ballot from your clerk, receive it, fill it out, and mail it in, or drop it off at your clerk's office, or take it to a secure drop box. Does anybody have questions about early voting before I get into permanent? Yes.
Yeah, starting at the age of 50, I started to notice a tremor in my writing hand. Now I'm in my mid 70s, and that tremor has really ramped up. It affects me when I do fine motor skills, like signing my name. So my signature may not quite appear as I put it on a voter registration card half a dozen years ago or 10 years ago when we moved here to the Holland area, Ottawa County. My signature has continued to digress. What do I do about that? And will it be tabulated or not tabulated based on the way it's done right now?
I'm going to let Kristi answer that question.
And I don't know if I need to get in for the Zoom folks. The question is about as someone's signature changes over time, whether it be because of some motor skill decline or some other injury temporarily. Clerks have taken a bit of training, they've taken training on signature verification. They've been provided with standards on that and some framework to that. But we have the Michigan qualified voter file is fed by the Michigan driver's license file. So how you signed your driver's license is the signature that a lot of clerks will see and compare against, but they are instructed to look for like characteristics of the signature. I know that I tend to be in a hurry sometimes, and I may not sign my full name Kristi Lynn Dougan or Kristi L. Dougan, and I just do a quick KL Dougan, but they're looking for those large letters. Similar people have, they pick up their pens at different junctures within the signature. They have the same pressure at certain junctures of their signature. So I get that. But when it comes to whether Michigan does allow folks to simply make a mark or use a rubber stamp of their signature, should they require that as a part of declining motor skills. And that information the clerk would verify with the voter and essentially make part of your record that is how your signature will be appearing on your ballots and documents. So they have the ability to put those notes in there and they verify that. And that's also another one of the benefits of clerks serving their community, that know their community, they know their voters, and they look at a lot of different characteristics. And they may call and double check, but anytime that a ballot is submitted or an application that's submitted with what we consider an invalid signature, or a questionable signature, or a missing signature, clerks are required to contact that voter and let them know that their signature needs updating in order to issue them a ballot or have their ballot count. One of the benefits of Proposal 2 is that if you've submitted your absent voter ballot and you got that notification from the clerk, you would have up until 3 days after the election to cure that signature, either go in person and sign in front of the clerk or provide appropriate documentation for that. So, and still have your ballot count. So there is an extended grace period for that, lots of notification, but then lots of clerk training and I don't want to say necessarily leeway, but they're not looking for perfection, but they're definitely looking for light characteristics.
And that is one of the beauties of having such a decentralized system, because our clerks, both at the city and township level, mostly know the people who vote in their districts. I would like to, looking at the clock, I'd like to skip ahead and then I'll come back to some of these slides, but I would like to just talk for 1 minute here about the permanent mail ballot versus there are two. You get the application, and some people might prefer that they get an application every time before an election for an absentee ballot. But there is now, thanks to Prop 2, the ability to be on the permanent absentee ballot mailing list. And if you are, they will send you a little card like this in the mail, just a notification to make sure that, and this should come from your clerks in your districts. I have the district map over there so you can see if you know your district. And it will just ask you, according to our records, you have selected the option to receive an absentee ballot by mail for further elections and will be receiving a ballot for the August 6th, 2024 primary. Please contact your clerk immediately if that is not your plan. So, you know, I think because this is new with the permanent ballot, they're checking all the time just to make sure this is what you want to do and have decided to vote absentee. Any questions there on the permanent versus the application to get a absentee ballot? How many people find yes? I received this card from my clerk. I'm in Park Township District, and I received this before my ballot actually came. Now, because I signed up for the permanent on my last ballot, I received this, and then I have received my ballot for the primary. If you have not signed up for an application to get an absentee ballot, you may do so online, or you may do so by going to your clerk's office. Does that answer the question? Can they check online with that, Kristi?
So those cards would be a clerk by clerk basis based on the resources. They may have sent that out. Some are doing a little bit more outreach than others. With perm ballot, there isn't a way for you to log in. I would check with your local clerk. You can go to michigan.gov/vote and get your clerk's number, and you can give them a call or an email and just email them and they will double check that. I'll say with perm ballot, the only caution is if you are a traveler or have multiple homes, like maybe you have a winter home and a summer home, it's important to always update your address with your local clerk because they don't always know. So sometimes it's a good option, but maybe not the best option for those that are in multiple places. So, but you can always ask for a ballot from the clerk.
I just have a question on a permanent ballot. When it's a partisan primary, is there any difference to just with the clerk sending out the ballots? The clerk will send out, if you're on the permanent ballot list, ballots in every election, even if it's just a partisan primary election. And are you going to have to make any declaration of what party that you're affiliated with?
This year is a weird animal as far as, in February, we had a presidential primary in Michigan, and that has additional requirements for the voter to tell the clerk which political party's ballot they wish to receive. The August state primary is a different sort of primary where all of the nominees will be on the same ballot, and it's up to the voter at their own choice to make their selection, but they must quarantine their selections to a single party, but they don't have to tell the clerk which one they chose because they're going to come on the same ballot. So we won't have to worry about that ballot selection for another 4 years. But with the permanent mail ballot, when you do sign up, those ballots are available 40 days ahead of the election. So those are the first ones out the door. So if you need some time or want to know you're getting your ballot right away. So tomorrow is day 40. So clerks are furiously stuffing envelopes and getting to the mailboxes. So I would see those hitting your mailboxes within the next week or so.
To that effect, I'm not originally from Michigan, so maybe this is a Michigan thing. Maybe it's, I've been lost in a fog when I voted in the past, but why is it that Michigan corrals you into one party over another? Because she just said they did. So I'm working with that, and I'm just wondering because in the past, I believe I voted in one of the many states I've lived in, that if there was somebody from another party who I thought was particularly good, even though they were not from my party and would be a stronger candidate, I would like to have the chance to vote for that person. So I'm wondering, why is that a necessary element of our elections?
Boy, I don't have the answer to the why we have to vote. Maybe Steve can tell us why.
I can at least, if I can't speak to exactly why Michigan's rules are the way that they are, I can at the very least give you kind of a national perspective. Pardon me, Claudia. So, so there are some states that have open primaries, and in the open primary state, especially for the presidential primary, but also for state level local offices that are partisan, you can vote for any candidate of your choice. Michigan's system is essentially what's, this doesn't make any sense, but it's what's called is an open closed primary, which is obviously nonsensical. But the but what that means is we don't have party registration. Most states have party registration. And so when you register with a political party, you go to vote, your political party is on the poll book where you check in, they give you the correct ballot, your poll workers give you the correct ballot, and you vote that party's ballot. Michigan doesn't do that because you're not registered with a political party, but you do have to select a political party. And that's in the presidential primary. In the state primary that's coming up on August 6th, that has both parties on the ballot, but you have to pick a side of the ballot to select. And that is in Michigan. I can't remember other states, but there are other states such as California and Alaska, I think Alaska, that have a top 2 primary. And in those systems, all of the candidates for each office are on one office, essentially, one contest. And the top 2 candidates, regardless of party, are the ones that advance to the general election. And that's relatively new. Like I said, a couple of states have that. And that allows any voter, regardless of party, to vote for their top 2. So nationally, that's very unusual. Michigan's system is slightly more common. And the most common system is that you're registered with a political party to begin with. And if you're registered as an independent, you're not eligible to vote in a partisan primary. So Michigan gives you the option to select a party that you want to participate in, but the state law does require that you select a party.
It is confusing.
It's just the primary. It's not your final vote.
No.
So that's why they want you to declare only for the primary.
That's good clarification.
Per primary. You
So
declare each time which ballot you want.
sort of. Yes, only in the
Only the
presidential primary. Every election, every state has its own rules, and then a subset of that is every election in every state has its own rules. So in the general election, you can vote for whoever you'd like, whoever appears on the ballot. That'll be in November. For the August election, even though both political parties at the state level, the Democratic and Republican parties have qualified for the primary ballot. So those 2 parties will have candidates, and those elections are essentially intended to whittle down candidates for the general.
Does that answer your question, Lauren? I mean, your ballot for August, whether you vote in person or you request an absentee ballot, will have both parties on it. But you must vote only one side of the ballot. If you cross over, your ballot will be rejected and spoiled. So and then in the general election, you may cross over and vote either parties. But Michigan does not, as Steve said, you do not have to, except in the presidential, declare who you are voting for. So I know it seems confusing, and that is why I wanted to go here. And just before we wrap up, prepaid postage is a nice plus for those who vote absentee. You don't have to worry about finding a stamp, and you just drop it in the mail. Just remember to sign your ballot according to the way that you registered when you signed up for your voter registration. And then on the other, let's talk about the drop boxes just briefly. They are secure, but it is important. The drop box is not a mailbox. So when you complete your ballot and you decide, I'm not going to use the postage paid, I'm going to drop it in a drop box, you must drop it in the drop box where you are registered to vote. You can't use any drop box. And I will tell you from experience that the city clerk in Holland does a wonderful job, because people who live in Park Township and Holland Township go, oh, I was downtown, had my ballot completed, I'll just drop it in this drop box. Well, if she had not been able to notify Park or Holland Township, your ballot would not have been counted, because you are not registered to vote in the city of Holland. So when you choose your drop box, look at the markings, let me see, on your envelope. And it tells you where to return your absentee ballot if you choose not to mail it. And that says you must drop it in the drop box for the city of Holland, which happens to be right outside of City Hall, if that's where it came. So those are very important things to remember. The drop box is not a mailbox, and it won't get mailed anywhere. You can drop it up to 8 p.m. on election day in your drop box, and your ballot will be counted. They are secure, they are bolted, and nobody else, and they have a video on them. Let's talk about what's coming next. On your ballot, this is where you must choose a party. It is interesting, and this is where you choose basically who is going to appear on the November ballot. And so in many cases, the importance of voting in the primary is they have no opposition to them, and you'll say, but you have to decide which party you are going to vote for. And in 2022, there were 224,301 registered voters in Ottawa County. Only 76,000 people cast their vote. Only 34% of the people who voted in 2022 in the primary decided who was going to be their elected officials going forward. So that is why primaries do matter, because in many cases, you can see here in a primary race for the Ottawa County prosecutor, these are the only people on the ballot, these two people. Whoever wins this primary, they will be the prosecutor, because there's nobody to oppose them in the general election. The county sheriff is the same way. Whoever wins that primary will run unopposed in the general election. That is why primaries are important to vote in. And I know they fall at an unusual time of the year in August, and people might be on vacation. That's why absentee ballots. So what you have in front of you from Ottawa County are the people running in the primaries. And if they're highlighted with darker, that means you have to vote for one. You vote for one of those two people. In some cases, they may be running they might have some opposition from the other party. If you don't know your district maps are up there. And I know that we are out of time. Are there questions that any of us can answer. I wanted Rose and I will stay after and show you how to use Vote 411. It is vote411.org on your computer. It will have all of the candidates on this. It will be populated by the candidates. The League of Women Voters makes 411 available to you, but it does not populate what the candidates write to the questions. Those are done by the candidates. If a candidate did not respond, there will be a blank there. We would not, the league will not put in their information. This is a very useful tool because it is very important. Your local races at the local level and the state level probably have the most effect on you. I know we all hear a lot about the national races, but the local races make a lot of local decisions for you. So this is where you may voice your opinions.
Fabulous. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Kristi. Thank you, Steve. For those of you who need to leave, feel free to leave. If you'd like to stay and ask questions, everybody is willing to stay and keep talking. Thank you.